Well, we're going to be looking at evidence for the resurrection tonight, and I might just go up on the stage so I can see my own screen. I want us to begin with some of the non-Christian accounts which give us a background for what we know about early Christianity. Then I want to look at Christian accounts. The reason I begin with the non-Christian accounts is for the more skeptically inclined, at least we know the Christians didn't write the non-Christian accounts. So it's interesting to look at those and see what they actually tell us. The Christian accounts go into more detail and tell us about the appearances of Jesus risen from the dead and the empty tomb, and we're going to be looking at whether that's reliable. And then mysteriously we're going to end on the third leg of some stool or other. But let's begin with some non-Christian accounts. The year is 64 in Rome. There is a great fire, and Nero is emperor at the time. It is commonly thought that Nero started the fire. That makes him less popular. He didn't have to face an election, but he still wanted to make himself more popular, and so he blamed the Christians. Now, there's a man who wrote about this, the Roman historian Tacitus, who actually lived in Rome at the time. Admittedly, he was just a young boy, probably about aged 8. But he's someone who is so reliable, people are prepared to trust him for things that happened outside his hometown many decades before he was born. And this is what he says about this great fire in Rome. But neither helped by humans nor generous gifts from the emperor, nor all the ways of placating heaven could stifle the scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. That's order of Nero. Therefore, to scotch the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd called Christians. Pause. Christians. We have this mention of the word Christians. Well, that's an interesting word in itself, because Christians, of course, implies the word Christ. These are people who follow Christ. Christ is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Messiah. So if there are people called Christians, we know this group is following the Messiah, and that's the expected Jewish leader. In other words, just from this name, you can derive a certain amount about their belief, namely that they believe that the promised Saviour of the Jews has come. Christian also is a word, according to this passage, which is used by the crowds. Not that the Christians called themselves Christians, it's the crowds who called them Christians. In other words, it was outsider language before it was insider language. Like the word Methodist. At first, Methodists didn't call themselves Methodist, it was an insult. Then the Methodists called themselves Methodists. Or Quakers. That was, again, an insult at first. Then the Quakers, the Society of Friends, start calling themselves Quakers. So the word Christian is outsider language at first, then becomes insider language. The three occurrences of the word Christian, which are found in the New Testament, also all imply that it was first used by other people. The disciples were first called Christians at Antioch, says the book of Acts. Or Agrippa says to Paul, "You almost persuade me to be a Christian." Or 1 Peter says, "If you suffer under the name Christian, don't be ashamed." In other words, all three are outsider language, by the way, showing you that the New Testament documents are early, because it wasn't very long before Christians started calling themselves Christians. But here we're at an early stage, and it talks about Christians as an outsider term. Then he continues, Tacitus continues, Christus, that's Latin for Christ, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius. Tiberius was emperor from the year 14 to the year 37. And it happened by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Wow, so he's someone mentioned in the New Testament, mentioned in the Gospels, and he's also mentioned here. Spread to Rome. From another author, Pliny, we know it also had spread to northwest Turkey. We could read that passage, we don't really have time. Non-Christian writers tell us about how far and how fast Christianity spread, and what they also tell us is how difficult it was being a Christian. They don't say that from the point of view of sympathy. They think the Christians are really weird and stupid. But they do tell you information which tells you how difficult it was to be a Christian. And I think that is a significant backdrop for understanding early Christianity. Of course, the fact that people are martyred doesn't mean that what they believe is true. All sorts of people die for all sorts of systems. But when people die for something, it does at least show sincerity. This can be delusional, I admit, but these people, I think, are at least sincere. The other thing is that Christianity has spread quite a long way. It spread all the way from Jerusalem across to Rome, about 1,500 miles. What's 1,500 miles from here? I don't know. But it's quite a long way, and it spread in something like 30 or 35 years. That's significant, because some people like to say that the stories of early Christianity got changed because they were told over such a long period of time. And over 50 or 100 or 200 years, these things can change. The problem is, if Christianity spreads really far and fast, and there are large numbers of Christians in Rome, as it says here, the more Christians there are and the further spread they are, the harder it is to say that the story is just getting changed all the time. It's such a short time. And anyway, it means that if the story wasn't in place at the beginning, what was in place? And if a later story was, if someone came along and tried to change the story later, there's a problem. There are so many Christians all over the place and they're all dying for it. Not all of them. Some of them are dying for it. There's a high cost. It's very hard to imagine them all accepting a sudden change to their belief. You know, you've been Christians and you've been dying for it. Well, now we've got a new idea. Jesus actually didn't stay dead. He came back to life. It doesn't really work. In fact, the very idea that these people are dying for it might well suggest that they believed in the resurrection. It actually, these non-Christian accounts, and there are others we could look at, tell you the same picture as you get inside the New Testament in a book called Acts. It tells you that Christianity spread far and fast and it was hard being a Christian. So that's all I want to say by way of non-Christian accounts. Let's look at Christian accounts. Now, it's not just the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, that we have that could tell us about the resurrection. In fact, any of the books in the New Testament, and there are 27 of those, could tell us something about the resurrection, because even the very, very short ones, although they may not speak about the resurrection, speak as if Jesus is still alive in some way. So 2 John or 3 John, which are really short letters, you can read them in just a few minutes, they are talking about Jesus as if he really is alive. And that was something that there are many, many documents of that kind. But let's home in on the 4 Gospels, which are the 4 accounts of Jesus' life. There are some problems when we look at the accounts in the Gospels, because they actually have some differences as they record that first Easter morning, Sunday, and the idea is that women go to the tomb and they see the tomb empty, and soon Jesus appears to people risen from the dead. But actually the 4 accounts have some differences. We could say some of the accounts have 2 angels there at the tomb and some just seem to have 1. There's a question about whether the women went to the tomb first and saw the angels, or whether the 2 men who ran to the tomb, probably Peter and John, did that first. What exactly did the angels say to the women? And when did Mary first learn of the resurrection? If you try and fit the 4 accounts together, you'll find some differences. The big thing is really common to all of them. The big thing is that Jesus rose from the dead, that women were first at the tomb was empty, the angels appeared, all those sorts of things are the same. But then they actually differ on some of the medium sorts of things, which we're going to think about a little bit more. This is how one scholar comments on the subject. He says, the later we imagine these stories in the Gospels being written up, let alone edited, the more likely it be that inconsistencies would be ironed out. In other words, those sorts of differences in the Gospels show us something more like that the 4 Gospels are independent of each other. They haven't all copied off each other. Another thing we can say is that the 4 Gospels don't claim to be complete. Each one of them has information in its narrative that implies there is much more that could be said. So Matthew will tell about how Jesus had directed them to a mountain, but doesn't actually report when Jesus did do that. Mark tells something similar. There's another time in Luke's Gospel when it talks about one person telling Jesus how a couple of people have run to the tomb, but it doesn't actually tell in the narrative when they did run to the tomb. In John's Gospel, there's a time when it describes Mary Magdalene as being at the tomb, and you might think she's alone, but she comes back and she uses the word we, suggesting she probably wasn't. In other words, all 4 of the accounts are not claiming to be complete. So I want to say, let's treat these 4 accounts as basically independent. They've got some signs of authenticity in them. Now, this may be a bit hard to get your head round, but you're an intelligent lot, so I'm sure you will. When I look at Matthew, Mark and Luke, Matthew, Mark and Luke as Gospels are they've got a lot of common material, a bit different from John's Gospel. And they have a lot of common wording. One of the really interesting things is, though, that they agree more in their wording when they're quoting people speaking than at other times, which I guess is what you'd expect to happen if they're reporting truly what people said. And this happens in their accounts of the resurrection. If I look at how many words they have in their accounts, and I've given you the verses I'm talking about, Matthew has 136 words, Mark 138, Luke 123, for some passages talking about the resurrection. I then say how many of those words of each of those Gospels is shared with another of the Gospels. And you see it's not very many. Matthew has, of his 136 words, 10 common with Luke. He has 35 in common with Mark. Not a great proportion. You can see the statistics laid out. In other words, most of their resurrection account is their own words, and only small bits overlap with the other accounts. Now I want to show you something interesting going on. What you'll find, and I hope it's not too small for you to see, is that when they're quoting speech, they agree more than at other times. So here I've got Matthew on the left-hand side and Mark on the right-hand side. Matthew here is quoting what happened, and he says, "But the angel answered and said to the women," where Mark has, "he said to them." You see, it's a bit different. But then when it's actually what is said, the first thing is a negative command about do not be afraid or do not be alarmed. Well, afraid and alarmed are pretty similar things. Then Matthew has, "For I know that," when Mark has nothing. Then Matthew has, "You seek Jesus who was crucified," and Mark has, "You seek Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified." Now, how do those two accounts differ so far? They only differ by omission or addition. That's basically how they're different. You see, one bit has something extra that the other doesn't have. Well, when you're reporting speech, you don't have to report all of speech. They didn't have speech marks back then. It was great. Speech marks create a rule of uninterruptibility and not allowed to omit anything. If I put anything between speech marks now, and this is a modern convention because speech marks have only been around for a few hundred years, we now have different rules of quotation. Back then, they're allowed to omit things and still be completely true. Then it says, "He's not here for he has risen," or "He's risen, he's not here." Now, you can see that those two are pretty similar. They only differ in order. Now, that's exactly the sort of way, if we were to remember a conversation, we might well remember what was said, but put it in a slightly different order. So to me, that's a sign, not that one person has copied out with the other book in front of them, but in fact that these things come from memory. Then this one has an addition, "as he said," and then "come see the place where he lay, see the place where they laid him." Well, there's a "come" here, there's no "come" there. You can see it's really pretty close. But if I go to their accounts of the resurrection as a whole, I find that Matthew and Mark aren't so close. But when they come to the speech bits, they're really close. Do you see what I mean? In other words, that's a sign that what we're getting is actually, could well be what people said. We put Matthew against Luke this time. Again, when they're doing narrative, they differ. Then we have "do not be afraid." There's no equivalent of that in Luke, but Luke has "why are you seeking the living among the dead? For I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified." Well, so far that looks pretty different, although crucified and dead do sort of go together. Then we see, really strikingly, "He's not here for he has risen, he's not here but he has risen." The same order. Now, you remember when I put Matthew against Mark, there was an inverted order. So how am I going to explain that? Can I say that one's copied from the other? It doesn't really make any sense. And then we have some more differences. "Come see the place where he lay," and then "remember how he told you." So that seems pretty different. Let's put Matthew now against John. Now, Matthew and John's accounts of the resurrection seem really wildly different. Because Matthew has the women come to the tomb, there's An angel there tells them Jesus is risen, they run away, and then they encounter Jesus. When John gives the account of the resurrection, he tells you Mary goes to the tomb, Mary goes back, tells the disciples, 2 of the disciples run to the tomb, then it sort of has Mary back at the tomb somehow, but not explain how she does. She looks into the tomb, sees a couple of angels, turns round, sees a gardener, thinks he's the gardener, it's actually Jesus, and then you get this conversation. Now you can see those 2 accounts are pretty different, right? You know, if you try and fit them together, you think, how do they fit together? Well, I think there are many ways they can fit together, and we can go into that. But what's really interesting to me is that even though they are so different, so there's no way one copied from the other, we see they agree on the big things, Jesus being risen from the dead, they disagree on a whole load of medium things, but then they agree on some tiny things. That's the really striking feature. Because whereas in Matthew, Jesus meets these women and says, rejoice, and they came and took hold of his feet. John says, first thing Jesus says, first time he meets Mary, so it's the same sort of event, do not cling on to me. Now, holding on to his feet, do not cling on to me. Do not cling sort of implies that they actually did. So one could be said to imply the other. The other thing is he then tells her, or the women, what to say. In Matthew, it's do not be afraid, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they'll see me. Now, Jesus doesn't normally call his disciples his brothers. That's a pretty unusual thing for him to say. But here we have, he says, don't cling on to me, I've not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. He calls God his Father and says that he's also the Father of the disciples. Of course, when you have the same father, you are actually brothers. So what we see is that little throwaway phrase really fits very well into the other gospel. So they agree on the big things, they disagree on some medium things, and then they agree in some really remarkable tiny things. And you can't say they agree that way because one's been copying from the other. To me, that is a good feature of really true reporting. You get 4 accounts of the same event in 4 newspapers, and they're going to differ in all sorts of ways, by omission and addition and so on, in the whole angle they come at. You know, if we report what happens tonight, there's all sorts of different things we might say. But then you would find in true reporting just very tiny things that agree. But they agree in such a subtle way, there's no way you can say people made them agree in order to make the story look authentic. There are also things in these stories that you would be unlikely to invent. The very first thing is you'd be unlikely to invent a resurrection. The reason why is because a resurrection back then was deemed pretty impossible. For Jews, they believed that there would be a resurrection of all people at the end of time, or maybe all of God's people at the end of time, but not of one person out of sequence with the rest. That means if after Jesus has been crucified, you see a Jesus look-alike, the explanation you adopt is not, oh, Jesus has been raised from the dead. The explanation you adopt is, wow, I'm seeing a ghost, or I'm seeing an angel that, is taking on the form of Jesus. What you do not think is, I am seeing a resurrection, because guess what? The whole resurrection for the whole world hasn't happened. You know that. So for a Jew, the resurrection wasn't very likely. On the other hand, for the Romans, they generally had the attitude that when you died, what would happen afterwards was that you would go to some spiritual realm, or a realm of mind, but not a sort of physical thing. So the idea of someone coming back physically was weird and actually disgusting. I mean, gross. So how did something with that at the center of the message take off? So I think that's an unlikely thing to invent. But there's more unlikely things. All 4 accounts of the resurrection say that women were there as eyewitnesses. Excuse the funny font at the top, that's Greek. But I know some of you read that. But this is what a contemporary Jew says. And I do excuse him. He's not contemporary to now, if you see what I mean. Let not the witness of women be accepted because of the lightheadedness and insolence of their kind. Now, I do disagree with Josephus, but the point is he does represent attitudes of first century Jews. Why would all 4 resurrection accounts talk about women being the first people at the tomb when people didn't trust the testimony of women? It's not a way of making the story credible. So, at least Men didn't trust the testimony of women, let's say. And so if you want to win any men, why would you write it like that? And yet that's the way it is. Another thing you have strange in all four accounts is bright angels but a normal Jesus. What I mean by this is when I have Matthew's gospel, it talks about an angel wearing clothing white as snow, Mark a white robe, Luke dazzling clothes, two angels in white in John. They've all got bright angels, but no dazzling Jesus. Now, if I were going to make up the account, I would make sure that the number one guy, the person who's the real centre of attention, gets the dazzling clothes. But we don't get that. The angels get it, and, you know, they're part of the support crew. So what's going on here? It's weird, but what we see is, despite all the differences that there are in the accounts, they're not seeing Jesus as a dazzling character who's been transformed into something that really isn't very physical. They're seeing a physicality to this, and the angels there in white. Another weird thing in all of the accounts is the record of doubt. Matthew is getting to the end of his gospel. This is the great climax. He's going to say about how Jesus commissioned his disciples to go out and reach out to the whole world. Great. He's 4 verses from the end of the gospel, and this is what he says. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Matthew, do you have no idea how to write a gospel? This is a great climax, and you have just ruined it by telling me that people have seen Jesus and straight after seeing him have doubted. I mean, that isn't very helpful, is it? I mean, how does that make you feel? But that's what he does. So the idea that people back then were just gullible and willing to believe any miracle doesn't really work. What about in Luke's gospel? In Luke's gospel, Jesus appears to the disciples in a room. And this is what he says. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your heart?" And then he goes on. It goes on and says, "While they still disbelieve for joy." In other words, Luke's gospel is saying they were doubting even when they saw him. Now, how does that make sense? It's to do with the angel thing. If you see Jesus risen from the dead, a Jesus look-alike, if you're thinking in a Jewish way, you think, this can't actually be him because we know he's dead. So it must be a ghost, it must be an angel, but it ain't Jesus. You see? So even in Luke's gospel, we've got doubt. In John's gospel, famously, you have doubting Thomas, a whole load about him. Mark's gospel, there is some debate about the ending, but in the longer ending, it's all about not believing. They didn't believe. So the point is, I have lots and lots of doubt. I don't have lots of doubt. I have had doubt. But we can talk about that if you like. What about conspiracy? I mean, the idea that some people conspired to sort of pull off a resurrection. One of the problems about this is there isn't very much time. And you've got to be able to pull off 2 things. You've got to be able to pull off 1, the empty tomb, and 2, resurrection appearances. Now, they actually require different mechanics. I mean, for an empty tomb, you need to get rid of a body and make sure no one ever finds it again. Maybe get past some guards or something like that, but okay. For the resurrection appearances, you need to convince people that they really are seeing Jesus risen from the dead, or bribe a whole load of people to say that they've seen Jesus risen from the dead, even though they haven't. So there are quite difficult logistics. One of those I could explain, but the 2 together, I've got a lot of work to do. And they don't have long to plan this. I mean, if Jesus is crucified on a Friday and the resurrection is supposed to take place on a Sunday morning, you don't have long. By the way, if you want to pull off a resurrection in the future, the best thing is to make sure your leader doesn't get crucified in the first place, because it's an awful lot easier to show them living when they haven't actually died. I mean, once they've died, it actually becomes much more difficult. So, and you know, people say, well, how do we know Jesus really died? Couldn't he sort of have, you know, been really badly hurt and just swooned in the tomb and so on? Look, Roman executioners were very good at killing people. It was their job. It was what they got paid for. And they really were pretty careful about that, because after all, not only would they lose more than their salary if they didn't actually kill the person. There is a story about how 3 people were once taken down from crosses because Josephus They were friends of Josephus, and he begged for them to be taken down. They were given the best medical care, and I think 2 of the 3 died. So even if you were taken down and given really good medical care, it's unlikely you would survive. Could it be a sincere delusion that people imagine they've seen Jesus risen from the dead? Well, that doesn't explain the empty tomb. And you can't really have group hallucination. Now, I hope none of you do drugs, but this is what, as I understand, about hallucinogenic drugs. If 10 people sit round all taking hallucinogenic drugs and they all hallucinate, they don't all have the same hallucination, right? Group hallucination doesn't really exist. It's not that, I see a pink elephant, man, and the other says, yeah, I see it too. It's not really like that. People go off, how often do you come and meet people and say, oh, I had a dream last night, and they say, oh, I had the same dream last night. It tends to be a little bit individualistic. So group hallucination doesn't really explain the accounts we have in the Gospels. What we have, I think, is a lot of independent witnesses. People say there are differences in the Gospels, and I've said that myself. But the best way to explain that for me is to say that if I add the 4 Gospels together, there have to be a minimum of 6 women at the tomb. Now, 6 women don't necessarily all bundle into the tomb at the same time. They don't have to do everything at exactly the same angle. Some of them might go in, some might stay outside. That means if the 4 Gospel writers each asked different women what they saw, and then they just carefully write down what they wrote, that would explain roughly what we got in the Gospels, and other methods probably wouldn't. The other thing we can say is that the resurrection appearances are hugely varied. Jesus appears to individuals and to groups. Groups varied from 2 to 500. He appears indoors, outdoors, in the country, in the town, on a hill, by a lake, by prior appointment, without prior appointment, and he appears far off, he appears close up. Every single time, they get close up, and every single time he's speaking. Now, put that alongside some of the sorts of things that people allege happens today in spiritual visions. You can see it's a lot more tangible. The fact that people eat with Jesus, the fact that the conversation is not just someone hears a voice, but they actually talk back, and then the voice talks back intelligibly and so on. That's what's going on. In other words, explaining this as just some sort of vision on a dark night when there's pretty poor lighting, it doesn't really explain the material we got in the Gospels. When Paul writes to a church in Greece and says, Jesus appeared to more than 500 people and most of them are still alive. Is he lying? Well, that's quite a risky thing to do. People could call his bluff and say, where are these people? His credibility is at stake if people find out that he's lying on something like that. So I would want to suggest to you that the variety of resurrection appearances, or should I say resurrection encounters we have, is really rather stunning. So it's the combined effect of the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances which are very strong. You could explain away one of them, but not the other. But I want to suggest there's also a third leg to the stool for a solid argument for the resurrection of Jesus. You see, if I made the case that there was an empty tomb and there were many people who saw Jesus risen from the dead, what if I made that same case about someone else, some random person called Philip or Stephen or whatever they were called? Well, on its own, I think it would be a good argument. But with Jesus, we have another thing, and that is all the other stuff which independently is known about Jesus. That is, Jesus seems to be a rather remarkable person. Have you ever heard of someone who was president of the USA, won the Olympic 100-meter, the Olympics, the 100-meter, also invented amazing scientific things, and was world heavyweight champion, and there are just too many things. You don't get them all together. Occasionally you get these brilliant people who can maybe do 2 things, sometimes 3, but usually number 3 isn't quite as good as the other 2. You know what I mean? There was Paderewski, who was Prime Minister of Poland and a concert pianist. Sometimes people get too much talent, and we get all upset about that. But you don't find these people who are just top of the world in loads and loads of independent things. But we have lots of really remarkable things we can say about Jesus independent of the resurrection. One of them is that he was already famous before this took place. So in other words, it didn't just happen to any old person. He was already believed to be the expected Jewish deliverer. There's all sorts of discussion about that. He's already believed to have performed miracles. There are more miracles reported of him in the Gospels than are reported of any ancient rabbi, and no one denied that he performed miracles. Jewish accounts talk about Jesus, and they don't deny that he performed miracles, they just deny by what power he performed miracles. The skeptic Celsus in the 2nd century, he didn't deny that Jesus performed miracles, he just said he did it by black magic. It's also true that very early on, Jesus was believed to have a genealogy descended from David, the ancient king. Now, that's a remarkable thing. In other words, it's the thought of the person who won the 100-meter Olympics and also happened to come up with this great scientific invention, also happening to have a really amazing genealogy, descended from someone famous. It's too many things together. He's also early on believed to have been born in Bethlehem, and I think I can give some independent evidence for that if we need to. The time of his death, even according to Jewish sources, without using the New Testament, Jewish sources says he was hung on the eve of Passover. Well, Passover was the one time of the year when the Jews celebrated the greatest deliverance they'd ever had in their history, and when they sacrificed a lamb. So if you want to have a good time for sort of wrapping up lots of symbolism, including all the sacrificial symbolism in the Jewish scriptures, then that was a good time to die. You've got lots of coincidences going on with Jesus. We can also say his teaching was rather remarkable. I don't read Chinese, but I like the font here. But Confucius made a rule which said, what you do not want yourself, do not force on others. Or, sometimes translated, what you do not want to do yourself, do not force others to do. That's a negative form of the rule. There's a rabbi who came up with something like that as well. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. Jesus, it seems, was the very first person to come up with it in a positive form. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, you might say, how do we know Jesus said that? Maybe one of his disciples made it up. Fine, let's say one of his disciples made it up and put it on his lips. But again, that's another coincidence about Jesus, that he had such a great disciple who came up with a really amazing thing and then decided to, put it on his teacher's lips. I mean, that's another great convenience to have. And like his parables, the parable of the lost son or the parable of the Good Samaritan, these sort of stories. What amazing stories to have attributed to you if you didn't actually say them. I mean, how cool could your disciples be? But, there we are. I mean, there are lots of nice coincidences about Jesus. I want to give you one further coincidence and then I'll close and we can have questions. Questions, I said questions, not questions and answers, just sometimes. We know that Jesus died between the year 26 and the year 36. That's when Pontius Pilate was governor. He died on a Friday. According to all early Christian tradition, it's been celebrated right from the very beginning. And we know he died on the eve of Passover. That has to be either the 14th or 15th of the month, Nisan. Here I've given you a Jewish source. On the eve of Passover, they hung Jesus the Nazarene. That's from the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud. Now, someone's done some calculations, someone in Cambridge, as to when you could have a Friday on the 14th or 15th of Nisan. And this is what he came to the conclusion, that you either have it on the year 30 or the year 33. If it's the year 30, then Jesus died on April the 7th. If it's the year 33, he died on the year on April the 3rd. So it's either 1980 or 1983 years ago, roughly this week or last week. So that's when it's calculated Jesus died. You can go a little bit more specific, because if we look at the Gospels, they say that the ministry of John the Baptist began in the 15th year of when Tiberius was emperor, and Tiberius began to be emperor in the year 14. So that gives you the year 29. And John's Gospel implies that Jesus had a ministry that lasted at least 3 years and really began after John the Baptist began his ministry. That means that the year 33 looks a lot better. And even the behaviour of Pilate looks a lot more explicable in the year 33 because he was politically weakened in the year 31 and he really needs to please the Jews. So that means the most likely date for the crucifixion is the 3rd of April, AD 33. Now this is where the coincidence comes, because in the Gospels it talks about there being a great darkness at the time, and there are some independent reports of that, although it's someone from the 3rd century talking about what someone in the 1st century said, but in a way that seems pretty plausible. But when Peter, one of the lead disciples, explained to a group of people 50 days after the crucifixion, he quoted a bit of the Old Testament that said, "At this time the sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the day of the Lord comes," quoting a bit of Joel. Now, it's only been known since 1983 that April the 3rd, AD 33 was the night of a lunar eclipse visible from Jerusalem. Lunar eclipse when the earth comes between the sun and the moon, as you know, means that the moon goes red, blood red. And to within 10 minutes error, people are able to calculate that from Jerusalem you would see a lunar eclipse between 6:20 p.m. and 7:11 p.m. that evening. A rather remarkable sign that coincided with the Jewish Passover and with Jesus' crucifixion. And that's only been known in the last few years. Again, it's a rather remarkable coincidence. And I want to suggest to you that there are many, many other coincidences that you come across when you look at the person of Jesus. Some people are upset about the idea of a miracle because they say that spoils science. Science makes nice patterns and miracles spoil it. If I allow miracles to happen in the world, how can I go on doing scientific experiments? Because everything becomes chaotic and unpredictable. I can understand that point of view, but I want to suggest this to you, that what if we say, rather than the miracles upsetting the order, we actually say that Jesus himself is the organising principle. In other words, what we have with Jesus is a number of things that converge and really make sense with him. Not just these things I'm talking about, but life. The message that is talked about through his followers about what exactly his death means. In other words, that it's not just that he died as some great example, but he died taking the punishment for the sins that we have committed, so that we can be forgiven. We can actually have everything that we've ever done wrong, and we've all done wrong things, we can have them all taken away. We can become innocent through him. In other words, there are so many different things that converge and make sense for me about the person of Jesus that I don't think it's a leap into the dark to trust in him. Rather, I think it makes sense of everything. Jesus makes sense of life, and for any who haven't come to know him and know how he does make sense of life, I would just commend further thought to you, and particularly reading the 4 Gospels and seeing what they say. Thank you very much for listening, and I think now there's an opportunity for questions. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. Did they take leap years into account? There are all sorts of things with calendars that are really complicated. They were using different calendars back then, the Julian calendar, and then we switched over to the Gregorian calendar, and they missed out 10 days in October and things like that. And so there is a lot of skill that has to be done. But people have tables of these things going back, which they work out every single day, and they account for every minute. The question of how it could fit together with something in Matthew 12, where it talks about the Son of Man, that's a name for Jesus, spending being in the heart of the earth, being buried for 3 days and 3 nights, rather like Jonah. There are different ways of counting that. One is to say that it's a fixed expression which you can't break down. Let me explain. If you say 2 weeks in French, they say 15 jours, 15 days. Now that's a bit weird to me, because if I count back, something happens one Sunday and something happens 2 Sundays later, they say it's, 15 days, 15 jours après is the way they say it, 15 days later. If I count back every single day, taking one off, I'm going to find that the first Sunday is one day after itself, right? In other words, it's an expression that you can't break down. Idioms are like that. I can't break down the expression, it's raining cats and dogs, to it's raining cats and things like that. I mean, the meaning is not made up by all the parts. The meaning comes as a whole. That's one thing. There is some evidence in rabbinic writings that a part of a day is counted as a whole day, and some people charge their businesses like that. If they just do part of a day's work, they charge you a whole day. And so that could be an analogy. And then also in 1 Samuel, there is at the end a story of how David goes off and he's about to fight against the Israelites, in fact, although he gets led off that. He then goes back to his hometown of Ziklag and finds that it's been raided. And he chases after these people, and they find an Egyptian in the field who says he hasn't eaten for 3 days and 3 nights. And if you do the calculation, you realize that it's more like 2 days and 2 nights by our time. So I think that the step that some people take of saying the crucifixion was on a Thursday or even a Wednesday doesn't really help. Obviously, if you put the crucifixion on a Wednesday, the problem is you might have too many nights and things like that. So I am very happy with a Friday crucifixion. What's an important thing about the resurrection for us to be talking about? Well, I think there are so many things, but the point is, the ultimate statistic that 1 in 1 die. And as people go through their lives, they come across more people that have died. And even, I remember in my 20s how several of my friends who were in their 20s died in different situations. It's something, and as you go on through life, it seems a greater number are affected. And here we have, isn't that the most ultimate question? Is there anything after death? Are you ready to die? And here is someone who was ready to die, who came back from death. That's the most amazing thing, and who also talks about what is beyond our death. So I think there is an awful lot that we can talk about there, just on the subject of mortality. And if this life, and enjoying the sunshine and sitting out in nice restaurants and so on, and fulfillment in work, if that's all, and the friendships we have, and it just comes to an end, is that everything? Don't you get a sense of however nice and fulfilled a life you live, it's rather futile. And so I think the fact that Jesus offers eternal life is, an absolutely wonderful thing to talk about. Thank you. I haven't read that book. The story that the disciples stole the body is, of course, even there in Matthew's Gospel, where Matthew says that that's a story that the soldiers were encouraged to make up. So it's a very old story. That does get rid of the body. I think pretty successfully. And it would explain why a few disciples might say, I saw Jesus risen from the dead. Are all the disciples in on it? Because the more you have, 10, 11 disciples in on it, the harder it is for them all to keep the secret. And particularly if they go on to suffer for it, then there's the question of why they would do it. The best thing if your leader has just been killed is just to go quietly away, and leave, stop digging a hole. It would just, the possibilities of it going wrong are just very big. So I think that's a problem. And then it wouldn't really explain, women at the tomb claiming to have seen him, people saying 500 people had seen him, 120, early believers in Jerusalem. And the fact that Jesus is supposed to appear both in Judea and in Galilee. They're just, phenomenal sort of practical problems. I think if people were going to try and make Jesus I think it would be better to steal the body and say he ascended into heaven. God took him up. Now that would be a far better story to make up. And then you could have him appearing in some visionary way to you. You know, that would be a bit cooler, a bit better to do. You know, less risky. Well, I think the possible gap between what you see on the History Channel and reality can be made bigger by several different things. I mean, one is what people like to watch. People want to be entertained. Therefore, the journalists are going to give them entertaining things. Then the journalists are busy. I mean, you know, they want story quickly, which does mean they want to get things out. They can't necessarily spend a lot of time research. Some people talk about media bias, and someone was saying to me the other day, we should be careful not saying media bias when in some situations they just don't know any better. So when you get into a situation where there's a certain dominant narrative in the culture, of course, most of the media grow up within that educationally, and so they don't know to step outside that, and so it sort of perpetuates itself. Then you have the academic discipline of history. Now, the academic discipline of history is a little bit different from studying reality. What I mean by that is it's more like hedge funds. I mean, hedge funds are made, you know, so that the investor doesn't lose. They hedge their bets. History as an academic discipline is often like that. Skepticism tends to pay. If provided you're skeptical, you don't lose face. So I would lose far more credibility if I say something is genuine when it's not, than if I am pretty skeptical of it and it is actually true. That's just the way the discipline's weighted. So there was a scholar who authenticated the Hitler diaries when they were false. And even though he's a great scholar in other ways, his reputation was really in tatters. And so there's a sort of people that are very risk averse. And that's different from real life. Because in real life, we are trusting things all the time on the basis of a single testimony. Someone says to me, you know, go to this restaurant, it's just past that place, and you take their word for it. I mean, of course it could be wrong, they could give you wrong directions, but all the time we're trusting a single testimony. When my wife says, I've just been out for a walk, I don't say, can you corroborate that? You know, I mean, yeah, I trust it on her basis alone. I mean, you go out for a very first date with someone, you know, and they tell you about their life, and you don't say, can you provide further evidence? You know, I mean, just that the relationship isn't going to go very far. So all the time we trust, you know, on the basis of single testimony. And so I think what people confuse is they read the Gospels and think that I need to be able to prove them by the slightly artificial academic canons of academic history, when I want to say no, all I need to do is look at and see whether they are trustworthy in the sense that things are trustworthy in real life, because that's a far better way of looking at things. It's to do with trustworthiness. And people, you know, sometimes want to say, give me scientific proof, but you can't prove anything important by science. You can't even prove that science is important by science. I mean, you know, you can't prove your mother loves you. I mean, by science. I mean, you know, we have mothers here, but prove the experiment that proves your mother loves you. I mean, I've got loads of evidence my mother loves me, loads. But someone can always explain it away. They could always attribute some other motive, and I cannot falsify that. Does that make sense? So I just think we need to get things, there's a bit of a long-winded answer to the History Channel, but we need to understand the sort of dynamics of evidence and proof, and we need to ask people to be real in life and honest in the, you know, and normal about the way we look at these things. So proving that you should trust the Bible is using the canons that we use for trust in everyday life. Certainly it does seem that the Gospel account, which talks about them meeting on Passover Eve, the Sanhedrin, the ruling, governing body of the Jews, does seem to talk about them meeting at a time when it would be rather irregular. But what we do see in the Gospel account is that they meet on the evening and then they assemble first thing in the morning. So I think you could see that assembly as the first thing in the morning as acknowledging the rule that really if you're meeting by night, it doesn't quite count. So when they're like the meeting's valid, they're quorate, you know, they then make the final decision. So I think even in the Gospels there is some acknowledgement of that. The other thing is, of course, you've got to be careful about using what is by the book and saying that says what actually could happen. I mean, sometimes governments will make rules that actually break the rules, and you can't sort of look back in history and say, but that can't have happened because that broke the rules. I mean, you know, sometimes these things happen. Someone was telling me the other day about how he was, you know, quite high up in the bailout in Britain, and that they were giving money to a bank contrary to the rules, but the money was still given, and so these things can happen. Q is a scholarly idea. When you have Matthew and Luke, they are often thought to have used Mark. And then there's things that they both have which Mark doesn't. And so things that Matthew and Luke both have and Mark doesn't, some scholars have said they've got from a common source, and they give it the letter Q because the German word for source, Quelle, begins with Q. That's why. It's a scholarly idea, it's a theory. There are some people who don't believe in it and some people who do believe it. I want to make a case for the reliability of the Gospels independent of whether that theory works or not. I mean, I'm happy with it being true or not being true. I think there's lots of evidence of the reliability of the Gospels, whether or not I accept that. I am on the sceptical side about that because no one in the deep past, in antiquity, talked about such a source. And it's one of those things that has to be widespread enough for Matthew and Luke both to use, and then has to vanish from history. So that's a bit of a problem, and there's some more problems with it as well. But having said that, if someone wants to believe in that, I'm quite happy to have a discussion with them about it. Yeah,
is it
Mark.
Q is the Holy Spirit?
Well, is it possible that Q is the Holy Spirit? I mean, scholars didn't invent the Holy Spirit. But obviously, we could say that one gospel has common wording with another gospel because of directly being told by God. On the other hand, God usually uses means. I mean, most of the things I know because people have told me, not, from God speaking by a voice directly in my ear. In fact, I don't think I've ever had that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen to other people, but I haven't had it happen to me. The thing about, I do think in the Gospels that every single thing that is reported there can come from an eyewitness. Even the conversation between Jesus and Pilate, Jesus could have reported to his disciples, or some of the soldiers nearby could have been converted. Every single thing reported in the Gospels, the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prays out loud, can be overheard. Every single thing can be reported. So although I'm happy God has the power to tell people directly, I also think there seems to be a tendency that he likes to use people to pass things on.